again. All right, so we again are picking back up in our study of 1 Samuel, and we're picking up again back in chapter 26. You know, where we left off last time, this is sort of in the middle of a section of 3 chapters that we noted at the beginning of chapter 24 marked sort of a section that was a section that is basically a defense of David against some of the accusations that Saul made against him, and in particular the accusation that David was out to try to take Saul's life any way that he could. And we note in chapter 26 that this is an account that is somewhat similar to what we read in chapter 24, but it also concerns about David having the opportunity to kill Saul in the wilderness of Ziph. And we talked about how this is not the exact same account as chapter 24. There are some writers who would argue that it is the same account, but perhaps another author just wrote a different version of it. But we pointed out that there are some notable differences that show that these are 2 separate events. And we will continue to pick up on that tonight. And as we left off last week, we mentioned that David and Abishai go into the camp where Saul is. And they have obviously observed the positioning as we talked about back in verse 7, verses 5 through 7. We talked about how Saul and Abishai, or David and Abishai, observed the positioning of Saul and his men. And then they go in and they enter into the camp. And Abishai has the idea that, you know, David, this is the perfect opportunity to kill Saul and to basically rid David's greatest threat at this point in his life. And we talked about last week that David was an individual that not only wanted to do the right thing, but he also wanted to make sure that those around him did the right thing. And in particular, this was his nephew, Abishai. And we noted how in verse 9, David said, you know, don't destroy him. Who can stretch forth his hand, or who can take hold and kill the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And as we noted, David was an individual that was not, David obviously would have known that he had a pretty good chance of getting away with this, but he understood that even if he's not the one that kills Saul, or literally thrusts the spear through Saul, David would hold some responsibility because he allowed his own man, Abishai, to do this. And David recognized he didn't have the right to get vengeance because vengeance belongs to the Lord, as we've seen in the other 2 chapters. But David has another idea, or at least suggests another idea about how to handle this situation. And what do David and Abishai do instead of killing Saul? Yeah, they sneak into the camp and they take Saul's spear that was laying close to his head, and they also take his container of water. And the reasoning for this is what we're going to talk about tonight as we begin. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. We'll mention these a little bit more in detail as we go on. A couple of principles to think about as we begin. You know, sometimes whenever an individual fails to do the right thing, it opens the door for us as Christians to do the right thing. You can apply this in any situation that you face. Perhaps, there's a situation going on at work where maybe somebody is, maybe somebody that's sort of shunned by the rest of the group, or somebody who's not thought very highly of by the rest of the group, and sometimes in cases like that, people can become neglected. And I think part of what makes a great place to work for is that there's a sense of camaraderie among the employees. And so, if you think about it in a situation like that, obviously we're called to be good. I know Paul would say in Galatians chapter 6, we're especially to be good to all those that are the household of faith, but there's the idea about being good to all men, as you see Jesus do on several occasions throughout his life. But whenever we face the opportunity in that particular situation, maybe somebody's not thought of very highly at work, or somebody that's neglected at work, there's nothing wrong for us to become a friend of that individual, to encourage that individual, to step in and do the right thing when nobody else will do that. We'll talk about how that applies to this situation tonight. And also, maybe something else to keep in mind. The things that God gives us, He expects us to protect those things. Whether that's our talents, our abilities, our possessions, the people that are in our lives that motivate us to be better Christians, God expects us to take care and to look after those individuals. And we'll talk about how that applies to the role of Saul tonight. But as we begin verse 12, we noted that, again, David and Abishai, they go and they take the spear and the container of water from Saul's camp. So verse 12, David took the spear and the cruse of water from Saul's bolster, and they gat them away, or they got away, and no man saw it, nor knew it, neither awaked, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them. So they get in, they sneak in, they take the spear and the water, and you know that they are able to get away cleanly, right? No man saw it, nor knew it, neither awaked. No one was alerted about the presence. And you have this particular statement here made that explains why no one knew about it, because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them. Now, why is it important to note that there was a deep sleep from the Lord fallen upon them? Why is that important to this account in David's life?
Well, it shows that the Lord's with David.
Yeah, it shows that God is with him. Anytime you look at these chapters that are talking about David's life, you always want to keep in mind how God has rejected Saul and how God has sought out a man after God's own heart. And so in these chapters where you read about the actions of David, whether that's in this particular passage, whether that's in the last chapter when David's dealing with Nabal, or whether that was when David was cornered by Saul earlier in chapter 23, and God delivered David by sending the Philistines to draw Saul away from that mountain. All of these aspects in David's life, whenever it mentions God connected to the actions, it shows that God was on David's side. And that's the importance here. This is not a coincidence that everything sort of just worked out perfectly where they were able to get in and get out with nobody noticing. But God had a hand in it, and it shows that God's favor was on David and not on Saul. So as we talked about before, later on in David's life, when things start to go bad towards the end of his reign as king, there were at least a couple of individuals in 2 Samuel that pointed out that these bad things were happening because David had they put David responsible for killing King Saul. And we know that to not be the case because of all these instances where David spared Saul and how God was on David's side and helping David out along the way. So this is not a coincidence that this is work. God is actively involved because He has created this deep sleep to fall upon these men. Now, where else in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, do we read about God creating a deep sleep on a person? Adam, right? Genesis chapter 2, verse 21. In fact, it took me a minute there because I was trying to decipher whether y'all were trying to get my attention or you were actually saying the right answer, and you were. But the word here in verse 12, the term deep sleep, it's the exact same term that's used in Genesis 2, verse 21, where Adam is put in a deep sleep for what purpose? Right, to take out a rib from Adam's side to create a woman. It's the exact same term here. And so you know that's a very deep sleep. If Adam was asleep and God could take a rib out of him without Adam being able to feel it while it was happening, you know that this is a very deep sleep. So you might want to connect Genesis 2:21 to that idea. That is more than just normally sleeping heavily.
Some would say that preachers have not that same power.
Yeah. That's true. Some preachers may come close to that power. Hopefully that's not to be said of either one of us, I guess. Hopefully that's not the case. So all of this has happened not because of coincidence, because God has helped David out in this process. So, verse 13, they've taken the spear, they've taken the water. It says that David, and obviously Abishai is connected to this, and possibly Ahimelech, right, back in verse 6. They go over to the other side. They stood on the top of a hill, afar off, a great space being between them. And that's verse 13. So we keep in mind Saul and his men were encamped on the hill of Hachilah, right? And that's back in chapter 26, verse 3, where you read about that. So the picture is David has left where Saul's encampment is on that mountain. He's gone down from the mountain, and as the text says in there, verse 13, there's a considerable distance in the valley between the opposing mountain where David's at, right? It says that there's a great space being between them. And as we pointed out the last time, perhaps this also is a way that David ensures his own security, right, by keeping a distance from Saul. But the picture is that Saul and his men, they're encamped on a mountain. David has gone down to the valley and has gone up to the opposing mountain, and he's about to call out to Abner here across the mountain. Now, I was sort of interested in this because you think about being able to communicate from one mountain to another. It would seem like it would be almost impossible at that time. You don't have a microphone like I've got up here. You don't have a megaphone. You don't have any type of electronic device that can amplify sound like that. So I did a little bit of research about why it is that sound, in particular human voices, can travel better when men are elevated or they're up on a mountain. And this is a couple of things that I figured out that might be interesting here to help explain how Abner and Saul and David were able to communicate across these two mountains. So the individual pointed out that one reason why this could be possible is that you have to take in consideration the air between the two mountains. And he pointed out that generally whenever you are speaking on flat ground, there are more objects there that are going to absorb the sound. So for instance, he pointed out like soil and plants and things of that nature. And you keep in mind where we're talking about, this is a wilderness. In particular, this is a desert wilderness. There's not a lot of vegetation. There's not a lot of, probably not as many animals in that area as other places. And so his point is that the higher you would go up in that situation, the less there is around the air to draw in the sound. And so that it almost is sort of like the sound is amplified in that way, because there's less that would absorb that sound. He also pointed out that because of the nature of the rocks and the hills, it would also allow for a human voice to carry a little bit more than you would expect. And the point being is that generally whenever you speak, and as I'm speaking here tonight, the sound from my voice not only travels forward, but it also travels backwards. And his point is that whenever you are on a mountain, generally you've got rock or you've got something that is at your back. And so instead of the sound going both forward and backward, the sound basically, when it goes backward, it hits the rock and bounces back forward with the rest of your voice. And so sound travels a lot better because of that. Likewise, if you are listening on a mountain, when sound passes by you, it will. So say if you're on a flat ground and you hear sound, or if you hear somebody talking to you, right? The sound approaches you, it goes in your ears, but sound also passes behind you, because that's what sound naturally does. But if you're on a mountain listening to somebody speak, the sound comes in, you listen to it, you hear it in your ears, but it's also hitting the back of the mountain where you're at, and so it's like it comes back and you hear it again. And the point being is that the sound is amplified, and it helps explain why David and Saul and Abner are able to communicate across mountains, because there's less there to absorb the sound, and you have the reflection of sound. It's the same reason why an echo works, is what he was pointing out. Generally, you think about echoes, you've probably seen cartoons and movies where you see actors, right? They'll yodel or something like that across mountains and they'll hear the echo come back to them. Same idea here, and that's why this works. And so I was interested in this. David obviously knew that this principle would work. That's how they're able to communicate. And communicate is exactly what they do. Verse 14, David cries to the people and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, "Why do you not answer, Abner?" Then Abner answered and said, "Who are you that cries to the king?" Now it is interesting here, right? David doesn't call out Saul, right? David's problem is obviously with Saul, but David doesn't call out to Saul here. He calls out to Abner, and there's a reason why he does this, as we're going to note in the following verses. All right, so David's first question in that question in that verse, right? Why do you not answer, Abner? So the picture is that David has apparently called out to Abner before, or David has made several attempts to communicate to Abner while he's on the mountain. And if you keep in mind the deep sleep from the Lord, perhaps that's what keeps Abner from responding right away. But after David has made several attempts, Abner responds. Verse 14, Abner answered and said, "Who are you that cries to the king?" Now, we noted before that the word cry would generally indicate the idea of a loud voice. And so Abner's concern here with this question, "Who are you that cries to the king?" What Abner's worried about is that David's loud voice is basically going to wake up Saul. Keep in mind, this is at night when this is happening, and Abner obviously does not want the king to be woken up out of his sleep early. If you're, I think most of us, right, don't like to be woken up out of sleep early. We'd like to get our sleep in. And Abner doesn't want Saul's sleep to be disturbed. And that's what his concern is. But David's about to show Abner that he should have had a greater concern. And that's where we come to verse 15. David said to Abner, "Are you not a valiant man? And who is like to thee in Israel? Wherefore then hast thou not kept thy lord the king? For there came one of the people in to destroy the king thy lord." So verse 15, there are two questions that David opens up and asks, and they're very important. They both show Abner's status and his good qualities. First of all, Abner, are you not a valiant man? The idea of valiant would basically talk about Abner's attributes. He's courageous, he's strong, he's powerful, he is daring, he is vigilant. Sort of the idea of the word valiant. He has the qualities of a good soldier. David recognizes this. The second question, who is like to thee in Israel? This is a reference to Abner's position within Saul's government, right? Abner is the right-hand man to Saul. He is the captain of Saul's army. We know, first of all, that Abner was Saul's cousin. When you go back to chapter 14, verses 50 to 51, Saul's father and Abner's father were brothers, and so that would make Abner and Saul cousins. We know that from David's time with Goliath that Abner was already at that point the captain of Saul's armies. That's chapter 17, verse 55. We also know when it came to just the very basic living in Saul's household that Abner had the most preeminent seat in the family. For a moment, I want you to turn in your Bibles to chapter 20, verse 25. Now, we've talked about this moment before, but I do want to bring up the positioning of where Abner is sitting. We keep in mind that this was the occasion where you had the festival of the new moon. David's not there, but Jonathan was. Now, note chapter 20, verse 25. It says that the king sat upon his seat at other times, even unto a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was empty. Generally, if you were an individual that was the closest to the king, you would sit at his side, generally at the right-hand side. In Luke chapter 14, verse 8, Jesus brought up this same idea, where he was warning people there that your ultimate goal when you're invited to a feast is not to sit at the right-hand side, which is where the most important person next to the person of honor would sit. That's not what your goal should be. But the point being is that right-hand side, that seat beside the king or the important person, show that you were also very important. Well, where does Jesus reside today? He resides in heaven, but how else do we say that? He sits at the right-hand side of God because he is the because he is the next in line to God. And we talk about that with the church, right? God gave Jesus the authority to be the head of the church. And that's the point being, because Jesus sits at the right-hand side of God. So that's important to note, because Jonathan, who is supposed to be the next king, he's the heir apparent, he doesn't sit at the right-hand side of the king. It's Abner. And so the point being is that when it came to people knowing who Abner was, this is a man that sat right at the right-hand side of the king. He was the most honored person, one of the most honored people in Saul's household. So who is like unto you in Israel? Well, no one. No one's the captain of Saul's army. No one gets to sit at the right-hand side of the king like you do because of your status as a man. And so Abner is David is saying, Abner, you are Saul's most trusted, most respected servant to King Saul. But here comes the however, right? However, wherefore, why have you not kept thy Lord the king? For there came one of the people in to destroy the king thy Lord. The word there for keep just simply means guard. Why have you not guarded the king? This is the very reason why Saul valued Abner, right? That's the reason why he sat at the right-hand side. That's the reason why he was the captain or the head of Saul's armies, because Saul trusted Abner. Saul trusted Abner with his life, and yet David points out here, you have betrayed the very purpose in which you serve Saul. Because here's the crux of the matter. One, an individual has come in to your camp and has wanted to kill your king. Now, how many people entered into the camp? Back in verses 8 and 9.
2 or 3.
It was 2, right? David and Abishai. Ahimelech stayed back. But David and Abishai had entered into the camp. But we recall, though, it was Abishai that had the intent to kill, right? Because that was his point, right? I can take up that spear out of the ground, and with one thrust I can kill Saul, and we can be done with this problem for the rest of our lives. That was his mindset, that Abishai could take care of the problem. So, who saved Saul's life in that situation? David did, right? Abishai had the intent to kill. Nowhere do you see Abner stepping in and saving Saul's life in that particular passage, even though he was the man appointed for that job. But it was David, on the other hand, who stepped in, right, and saved Saul's life, right? There came one of the people in to destroy the king thy Lord. David didn't come in for that purpose. It was Abishai. And so verse 16, this thing is that thou hast done. As the Lord liveth, ye are worthy to die, because ye have not guarded your master, the Lord's anointed. David, who has been portrayed by the enemy, who has been portrayed as the enemy of Saul, not just for Saul, but among Saul's own men, has now demonstrated himself that he is a better protector of Saul than Saul's own captain, than Saul's own most trusted servant, because David stopped Abishai from killing Saul while Abner was asleep. Now think about how important that is, right? Think about how important that is within the context. This is not just happening in front of Saul now, like it did in chapter 24. All of this is happening in the presence of Saul's men and in the presence of Abner. And all of this goes to show that David is an innocent man from the charges that have been laid against him. And now Saul's own men can't deny it, because of what David has pointed out here. So the end result, verse 16, is that because you didn't protect your master, you are worthy to die, because you have not guarded the Lord's anointed. Now we know that part of this extends back to Saul's actions. And Saul, in chapter 20, verse 31, Saul said that because Jonathan disobeyed him, that Jonathan shall surely be put to death. That was his own words about his own son. David actually uses basically those exact same words to describe what should happen to Abner. Just as Saul accused Jonathan of treason, David points out that because you didn't protect Saul, the Lord's anointed, in a sense you have also committed treason. You also are worthy to die. But do you think Saul's going to put to death Abner, who at this point has been his most loyal man? No, he doesn't. And in fact, later on, it's going to be Abner that sets up a rival to King David. And we'll get to that in 2 Samuel. But whereas Saul would have wanted to kill his own son in that particular passage, Saul's not going to be so unkind towards Abner in this situation. From what we gather and from sort of maybe perhaps common understanding, we might could say, but at this time and certainly in some degree today, if you're responsible for guarding something, especially if you're in the military, right? So say if you're, let's just say Area 51, right? You're stationed out in Nevada, and you're responsible for guarding Area 51, which is where a lot of apparently government secrets are kept. And say that you just decided to allow anybody in there, and you ignored all those security protocols, and you let people come in there and look at government secrets and records and things like that. Maybe you even let the enemy in and let them do that. What do you think is going to happen to you and your job? You're going to be fired, right? You're going to be put out of that position because you have failed to do your job. Likewise, this is very much the real fate that Abner faces here because he hasn't done his job. I want you to turn in your Bibles for a moment to Ezekiel chapter 3 because God puts a spiritual application on this. And this is where we can make another point of application. Ezekiel chapter 3, God talks to Ezekiel about his role, not just as a prophet, but as he says in that chapter, as a watchman. I'll get over there in my Bible, we'll look at that passage. All right, so Ezekiel chapter 3, let's look at verses 16 through 18. And it came to pass at the end of 7 days that the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word of my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say unto the wicked, Thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, know what happens to the man here. The same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at thine hand. In other words, God's message to Ezekiel is, I've called you to be a watchman or to preach my word to my people. If you refuse to do that, not only are the wicked individuals going to die through bloodshed, you're also going to die as well because you failed to do your job as a watchman. Abner has failed to do that same thing. The point, again, applies to us as Christians, right? We are, in a sense, called in the same way as Ezekiel was to be watchmen. Responsibility is to preach the gospel. Our responsibility is to teach others about Christ. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to do our jobs as the watchmen, God's going to hold us accountable for that. Just as Saul should have held Abner accountable for not doing his job. But Saul, again, is going to extend mercy to Abner, just as we're not perfect in taking advantage of the opportunities to act as the watchman in a spiritual sense. And so God still extends mercy to us, and that's why we ask for forgiveness of sins and make prayers for that. So that's a spiritual way that we could think about what has happened here. We are called to be watchmen like Abner, and there are serious consequences if we don't do our job. So verse 16, the verse ends with basically the evidence, right? And now see, where is the king's spear? Where is the cruse of water that was at his bolster? Or in other words, Abner and to the rest of the group, if you want evidence, go find the king's spear. Go find his container of water. And so you have the picture here of them searching around the camp to figure out where the spear and where the water is, and they realize that it's gone, which shows that David and Abishai did get that close to King Saul. Now, it is interesting to note that you don't see Abner talk anymore in this chapter. And if you think about it, Abner probably doesn't want to talk because he's been pretty embarrassed by failing to do his job. But now note what David and Saul talk again. Verse 17. And Saul knew David's voice and said, "Is this thy voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, my lord, O king." Now, I'll point out here, there's an important difference here between this account and chapter 24. We've mentioned some of these differences before, but in chapter 24, David called Saul his father. Right? David called Saul his father. You don't see that happening here in verse 17, right? He's still polite, he's still respectful to Saul. He calls him my lord, O king, but you don't see David call Saul his father. Now, why do you think that's the case? It would tie into what we talked about at the very beginning of class last week, potentially.
So that all the men would know.
So that all men would know, perhaps. Where is Michal at this point, or Michal, if you want to call her that? She's been given to another man, right? And the point being behind that is David's been cut off from the family, right? Saul took his daughter away from David. That's basically a way of saying, David, you're no longer my son-in-law. You're cut off from the family. So, in a sense, David understands, right, whereas Saul may consider him a son, Saul's actions taking away his wife show that David should not think of Saul as a father because he was cut off from the family. Which shows that development that we noted in chapter 25 comes into play here, right? It shows that this happened perhaps after chapter 25, which shows that this is a separate account from chapter 24. So David responds pretty much in a similar way, right, as the last time, right? Verse 18. Why does my Lord thus pursue after his servant? What have I done, or what evil is in mine hand? Again, David wants to know, what have I done wrong, Saul? Why are you pursuing after me? Now, the importance again of this is that this conversation is happening in front of all of Saul's men. So they're going to be witness to whatever Saul says here in response. So, verse 19, right? Now therefore I pray thee, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. All right, let's stop there for a moment. So David's point here is that there can be two ways to look at this. In chapter 16, verse 14, we read about how there was an evil spirit from the Lord that afflicted Saul. And we noted that because of Saul's wickedness or his disobedience to God. And so David's point could be here, right, if the Lord has stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. His point could be here that, in order to get right with God, Saul, you need to make an offering to atone for your sins. And so that way you're going to recognize that you have no reason to pursue after me, right? So could be that Saul needs to make the offering. It also could be looking at it from the perspective if David's wrong. Right? If the Lord has stirred thee up against me because I had done something wrong, again, let him accept an offering. In this particular case, if David's done something wrong, his position is, I'm going to make a sacrifice to God to make things right. And so that we can end this constant battle between you pursuing after me. But, verse 19, if they be the children of men, or if you're pursuing me because of what men are saying, cursed be they before the Lord. So in other words, if Saul is pursuing David because Saul's administrators like Abner and maybe some others are telling him to chase and to try to kill David, then let them be accursed before the Lord. Because that would mean that David's innocent. For they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. The inheritance of the Lord in this verse is a reference to the land of Israel. You see this a lot in the book of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses refers to the land of Israel, or the land that flows with milk and honey, as Israel's inheritance. So they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord. And this will directly tie into the next chapter where this indeed will happen, where David's driven out of the land, which is the inheritance of the Lord, because all Israelites were supposed to enjoy this inheritance if they were faithful to God. But here are the wicked men in Saul's administration that are trying to drive out a faithful and righteous man from his inheritance, which is the land of Canaan. And you know, at that end of that verse, it says that saying, "Go serve other gods." And so the point being here, David's not saying that if he's going to go to other lands, he's going to serve other gods. But the point being is, the point that he's bringing out here is that if you're driving me out of the land of Israel, you're saying that I have done something wrong, or that I have offended the God of Israel. And if that be the case, then what you're really wanting me to do is to go out of Israel and serve other gods, because I have made Jehovah mad. But we know that David has not made Jehovah mad, because God is with him at every step. But that's sort of the idea of that saying there, go serve other gods. It's not that David's going to go to Philistia later on and serve their gods. But the accusation that Saul's men have made against him to get him out of the land is basically telling him that the God of Israel doesn't like you anymore. And so you need to serve other gods, which David is not going to do. All right, so we'll look at verse 20 and then we'll take some comments. Right? All right, so now therefore, right, take into consideration what I've just said. Now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one doth hunt a partridge in the mountains. And if you recall, that quotation is somewhat similar to what David said earlier, right? Saul is pursuing after a very minor problem, right? He's got other bigger problems he needs to worry about. Now you know that phrase in verse 20, let not my blood fall to the earth. That phrase would indicate the idea of an innocent person dying. Let not my blood fall to the earth before thee. So the picture would be that, if you kill, David's saying, if you kill me, that means an innocent person has died and you're responsible for that. So that phrase, blood fall to the earth, carries the idea of innocence. If you remember when God was talking to Cain after he had murdered Abel, what did he say about Abel's blood? Yeah, the voice of thy brother's blood crieth from the ground. That's the same idea, right? Because we know Abel was innocent in that passage, but it connects to that idea. If the blood falls to the earth, was just a way of saying the death of an innocent person, just like it did with Cain and Abel. All right, so now, are there any comments that you would like to add on to what we've talked about tonight?
This is a textbook pattern of diplomacy and tact. David even saying, it's my fault, and I'll accept my fault, and I'll exalt the offering. It's not no finger pointing or name calling or running roughshod. It's just a wonderful pattern, like you say, of tact and diplomacy that I think a lot of the world leaders today could take a hint. Right.
And we're not going to look at that next section, but we'll note a couple of things before we go. But again, you see that idea, right, of taking personal responsibility, right? That's something that's expected of God's people. Whenever we mess up, we need to own it. We need to confess that we've been the problem. And that's what David's trying to do here, right? Take personal responsibility, right? Saul, if I've done something wrong, I don't have a problem going and making an offering and setting things right, because I want to do the right thing. That's the same thing that Jesus conveyed in Matthew chapter 5, right? If you've got a problem with your brother or with your siblings, if you've got a problem with your neighbor, before you go and worship God, you need to get that problem taken care of. That's Matthew chapter 5. In that particular passage, Jesus said to leave your gift at the altar and go and reconcile. Get that problem solved between your brother. Make things right before you try to come and worship me. And so David has that mindset, that very important mindset. And the final thing that I'll note before we go is that whenever we are extended mercy, we need to reciprocate that mercy. David extends mercy to Saul, right, now on at least 2 different occasions where David has given mercy to Saul. But the problem is, we'll see in chapter 27, Saul doesn't have any desire to at least permanently reciprocate that mercy. And it reminds me of that parable about the unjust servant, right, who was facing a considerable amount of debt that he wasn't willing to pay, and the Lord or the king over him decided to grant him mercy. And then that servant went out and found somebody who owed him money and had him thrown in prison because he couldn't pay the debt. And he didn't want to show mercy even though he was given mercy. And we know at the end of that parable that that first servant, the king finds out about what has happened, and the king goes and finds that servant that he forgave and throws him in prison for the rest of his life because he was expected to show mercy when he was given mercy. Saul had a problem with doing that. We as Christians have to recognize that as well. We have individuals that show us mercy every day, and that should motivate us to be merciful to other people. And that's something that we can take away from what we're looking at in Saul's life, David and Saul's life tonight. But we'll go ahead and stop here tonight. We'll pick up in verse 21 next week, and we'll try to get through at least part of chapter 27 next week. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention this evening.